Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. First up, reproductive health. What do we know about it for men? We'll unpack together the education, hurdles, and myths about male reproductive health. As well, with the end of the NBA regular season approaching next month, the Pistons have reached several milestones this year, including clinching a playoff spot. But nervous energy is in the air at LCA as the Pistons star Cade Cunningham remains out. What does it mean for the team's momentum heading into the playoffs? We'll find out from Pistons beat writer Omari Sankofa II. But first, we start with male reproductive health. In 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion for pregnant people. After the ruling, the number of vasectomy consultations and procedures increased. In the first 6 months after the Dobbs decision, vasectomy rates nationwide increased nearly 60% in men under 30 years old. That's according to the Planned Parenthood of Michigan. Abortions are legal in Michigan, but renewed interest in vasectomy still prompted the healthcare provider to announce plans in January to resume its vasectomy services. And 10 years ago, the organization suspended the procedure because they did not have the resources to support it. Vasectomies are just one small part of the larger umbrella that makes up reproductive health. And although there's growing interest among men to undergo the procedure, it does not mean men are understanding more about reproductive health overall. So, what efforts can be made to help men take a larger role in reproductive health? Dominic Shattuck is a community psychologist, a men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and a faculty member in the OB/GYN department of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He joins us now to unpack what it looks like for men to do that. Dr. Shattuck, welcome to the Metro.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Tia.
Of course. So I want to first begin by explaining what we're discussing. What actually does reproductive health entail?
I know it's a pretty big question, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot in there, and especially how you introduced it with the vasectomy increases.
Yeah.
So, reproductive health is really kind of looking at the knowledge, care, and decision making that people make and need around sex, fertility, contraception, pregnancy, and planning, right? So that kind of how they're developing their family and forming their family as a couple and even within their larger community, right? Mm-hmm. So for men, this should include a little bit more on traditionally we'll focus on condoms and STI prevention. But it also includes things like fertility, sexual function, preconception health we've been hearing a little bit more about now, and how men engage in relationships, and care across their lives.
Preconception health, can we talk a little bit about that, especially as we're talking about men's reproductive health?
Yeah. So what we mean by preconception health is how healthy is your body, and because it has big impacts in terms of your sperm motility and the sperm volume and things like that. We've seen studies that have come out showing that sperm count is reduced in men across the world. It's gone down, especially in the United States. And things like this. So we want to make sure that if you're planning to have a baby, you're healthy and you're showing up and your body's ready to do that as well, because it has big impacts for the gestation period in terms of the viability of that pregnancy. The men show up and they have a big impact on that as well, not just the women's health in terms of pregnancy viability. So it's important to pay attention to that. There was recently an interesting comedy special on Netflix by a man named Andrew Schultz, who's kind of a Joe Rogan-esque kind of person. Mm-hmm. But he talked about, very vulnerably, he talked about his own fertility challenges in that Netflix special. And I bring it up not to promote him, but more the promotion of a fact that somebody like him is actually talking about this and talking about how he thought it was an issue with his wife's fertility, but it really wound up being an issue with his fertility. And some of the things he did to actually change and make himself, fertile and ready to have a baby.
Dr. Shattuck, I think that is important to bring up about Andrew Schultz and just having the vulnerability to open up about his own reproductive health, which is something that oftentimes you don't hear men talking about openly and in front of a crowd of people at that.
No, you don't. No, it's very guarded. All right.
Yes. So, Dr. Shattuck, could you just give me a general breakdown? Just how much of the expectation to know about your reproductive system is placed on the women versus the men?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote too. So, I have been working in the sexual and reproductive health field for more than 20 years. I did a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa. I ran programs that were integrating different medical procedures and, contraceptive methods, including vasectomy programming in a country like Rwanda. But what was interesting is that I was 40 years old. I had two children, and I actually was making my own vasectomy appointment. And I realized as I was sitting there talking to the doctor, this is the first time a physician has ever talked to me about contraception, right? So I've been doing this work. I'd been doing it for quite a while at the time. And it was interesting because I kind of felt like, oh, I've been missed. Like my doctors they talked about STIs, HIV prevention, things like that, other related sexual reproductive health topics, but not contraception, right? And so women are typically kind of educated about this in the home or in their kind of peer groups. There's, because of menstruation, it becomes a little bit more kind of front and center for women than it is for men. But we need to expect men to care about this, but not just care, but also to kind of show up educated and having an understanding as to what is happening in not only the women's bodies, but their own bodies and how their body changes over time, whether it's, puberty and, first experiences with erections and things like this. But, it is kind of educating these boys and getting them ready for a life as an adult and making decisions and being educated in those conversations.
Some people may recall learning a little about this topic in their health classes, but that may not be the case for every person. How do men and women typically learn about reproductive health? How might they be similar, or how do they differ for men and women?
Yeah, many states have like a minimum amount of comprehensive sexual education, right? And so my daughters tell the story of being in the fifth grade here in Arlington, Virginia, and one of the last days of school, they kind of talked about reproductive health and then kicked them out for the summer, and that was that, right? Which isn't a very great way to do it. Oftentimes, girls get more of that attention and focus, and boys very often get this informally through conversations with parents and adults in their lives. And it comes in kind of a couple of messages, right? So it comes in, don't get anyone pregnant, avoid infection, and make sure you get consent. Now, those things are all super important, but those are pretty shallow messages, right?
Yeah.
And so, men need practical education about their fertility, about how to communicate these topics, as well as relationships and contraception and how reproductive health will change over time.
Yeah. And Dr. Shattuck, as a community psychologist, in what ways do you see that showing up? Almost this a negative connotation with the way that men are viewing, this particular topic. You were just talking about how it's just like, don't get anyone pregnant, don't do that, or make sure you're doing this, which are all important things for men to know, especially young boys as they're growing into men. But, what does that do to them mentally as they're going through puberty and just growing up in general?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed message, isn't it? Right. So you're kind of traditional masculine norms are going to teach you, oh, you should be dating, and there's the dynamics around being a successful male has to do with dating and being successful like that.
Yeah.
But hopefully that'll be changing over time. But I think the other element here is you're not getting the messages to kind of, allow you to show up in a way that is going to be more thoughtful, more engaged, probably more appreciated by maybe the women you're pursuing or the girls you're pursuing in your life at that point in time too. And also be a more understanding person in terms of, just the dynamics of reproductive health in general and relationships in general, right? So understanding and having empathy for other people. I mean, we've done programming around like menstrual hygiene management in different countries, and different schools have these programs in the United States as well. But you can't just educate the girls about this. You also need to educate the boys in terms of, some girls won't go to school in certain places because they don't have the menstrual hygiene products that they need, or they'll be stigmatized, or they'll be receive kind of negative comments from boys who maybe understand what's happening in their body, but
Yeah.
not really understand, or don't come with the empathy that's necessary to kind of support them in a really productive way.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Dr. Shattuck. I think that actually explained quite a bit for folks, just especially when we talk about early education of reproductive health, not just for women, but also for men. So, why does reproductive health education need to be more standardized?
Well, standardized and contextualized, right? So,
Hmm.
like, we want to make sure we hit some key points about knowledge and education around the topics of fertility, and what's happening in these young people's lives, and even older individuals. I mean, like I
Yeah.
mentioned before, I kind of
Yeah.
got through high school without a whole lot of education or even doctor intervention in this space. Um, and it was all kind of picked up on the streets with my buddies, and conversations,
Yeah.
kicking around town. But I mean, having it more standardized allows people to kind of start at a better baseline. So when
Hmm.
you're starting at that better baseline, you're able to kind of have conversations that are going to be more equitable, even for yourself as a young man. You can make decisions about your own reproductive life, and hopefully looking out for the other person you're in that sexual relationship with as well.
Now, Dr. Shattuck, you were talking about what you learned as an adult man about reproductive health, or just questions that you really weren't presented with beforehand. Having lack of information or lack of understanding about certain things as a young man for yourself. What were some things that you were missing that you have now been able to pass down to your own children?
I have two girls, so
Oh,
my
it's a little
perspective.
different, a little different, a little different.
Yeah, yeah, it is a little different, but it's also like I kind of can bring a little bit of my own personal experience to them to
Yeah,
help them. They've dated and things like this, and talking about open communication, and making sure that understanding they may have to coach some of these boys a little bit in that conversation, unfortunately.
yeah,
But for me, I think the big things, one of the things that was really interesting and eye-opening as I got into this space more as an adult, and then professionally, was just understanding, like, contraceptive methods for women are not just take a pill, all is well, you're not going to get pregnant.
yes,
Women manage a whole bunch of side effects related to contraceptive methods. I think about a quarter of contraceptive, you know uh, discontinuation or method switching is a result of side effects. And so for women, this is really, it's not just as simple as get an IUD and
yeah,
troubles be gone. I mean, sometimes it is, and for some women, they're fortunate in that context. But for other women, they maybe have to switch IUDs, or maybe they're trying a different formulation of the pill, or they
yes,
move from pills to IUDs or something like this. And those are medical decisions that take time. They take conversation. You could get pregnant in between if you're off method for a little while. You really need to navigate that, and this is why communication and being able to discuss this thing is so critically important in terms of both avoiding pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, but also kind of relationship building, and kind of working with your partner to build the quality of your relationship over time.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. My guest is Dr. Dominic Shattuck. He is a community psychologist, a men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and a faculty member in the OB/GYN department of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Now, Dr. Shattuck, how does the stage of life or the stage of a relationship impact the kind of information they need to have responsible conversations? Do people in younger relationships receive different information than those in a more seasoned one? Or are different conversations occurring at different stages?
Yeah, so you can imagine that, like, you know you need to have different elements and information related to reproductive health at different stages of life. And I think, in the beginning, you're really talking about making sure adolescents and high school students understand, like, the risks of pregnancy and unprotected pregnancy, also STI prevention, things like this, and kind of like laying a baseline for what methods are out there, so that when they do, if student children are having, or young people are having sex later and later in life, there's research around how the sexual debut is coming later, which is fine. It's people's, as long as people are making informed choices and their own choices, that's great. And I think it's important to kind of state that because, having that foundation and education around this so that when the time does come, that they're educated and they can make better decisions is essential here. But as they age and they get into, like, say, a committed relationship or potentially somebody they're going to marry or be in a long-term relationship, but potentially have kids, they start talking about kids, understanding what that means in terms of how healthy they are, when they want to start to really pay attention to their overall health, so that pregnancies are stronger and more viable, so that the children that they have in the future are healthier, but also, like, having those conversations around both contraceptive and reproductive health, but also like parenting. How do you show up? How are you a good partner when your wife or your partner is pregnant, and you going to the antenatal, the prenatal care visits? Are you going to how are you what books are you reading as a dad or a partner? How are you ready when that baby comes out to be supportive and taking care in those long nights when you have to kind of get up for the late night feedings and things like that?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of guys don't think about that. And the baby, and I'll be honest, like for myself too, a lot of it, you're never really ready for a baby,
Yeah.
but it does kind of hit you in the head sometimes if you're not prepared and you're not even having conversations around it, or your buddies are telling you like, oh, it's going to be fine. So I think the conversation expands as you get older, right? So it
Yeah.
becomes around those other issues of you know parenting, relationship, family. And then as you get older from that, even still, there are other dynamics around prostates and prostate cancer, and
Yes.
getting your test, your PSA tests, or having things like understanding what penile cancer is, a testicular cancer, and those things,
Yeah.
as they're or HPV vaccination and things like that. Just making sure, like, you get that well-rounded education in sexual and reproductive health so that you're making better decisions as an adult later in life.
So you've really prompted for us, or at least explained for us or to us, that men should be more attentive, not just with their own reproductive health, but also with women's health. So if so, how they do that without getting too invasive or controlling?
It's communication, right? So of course, it's a good question to ask, and you always need to be kind of talking through dynamics of consent
Hmm.
and cooperation and collaboration. Uh, you know, Having a partner who's taking on the burden of reproductive health kind of prevention or pregnancy prevention with a contraceptive method. Um, yeah, of course, you don't want to you want to make sure men are in this context where they're not taking someone's decision. But we find in the research oftentimes that, there are definitely contexts where women are using contraceptive methods because their husband, not because, but in a context where their husband may not be as supportive.
Mm.
But there are also a lot of contexts in which the husband is supportive, and he's there to show up for her. I mean, one of the programs that I ran in Rwanda, for example, even, men who get vasectomies, they were more likely to have conversations about reproductive health and even know that they were taking on that responsibility, um, because their wife had side effects from hormonal methods that that were difficult for her to manage over time. And so he stepped into that space and kind of took on that responsibility. So I think it really comes down to your relationship dynamics, and it comes down to, like, being educated, understanding what the challenges are and what the successes are with some of these contraceptive methods, um, and being open about it. I mean, relationships are hard. They're hard anyway. When you start talking about sensitive topics like this, it becomes even more difficult, and it really pushes the skills that you have, and pushes you to kind of move that relationship even further and hopefully to a better place.
Yeah. From what you've described, there is a lot of healthy communication that is required, of course, between partners to ensure
Right.
men can be more supportive, vice versa. I want to just briefly discuss the interpersonal communication that happens between two people who are sexually active. Now, sexual hygiene, as you've outlined, is important, but do interventions for reproductive health also include education around consent?
Yeah, almost every intervention I've worked with has a lot of discussion around consent and around, kind of talking through consent. What is consent? How does it, when do you have consent?
Hmm.
Those types of things. but it is something, if you're getting your conversation from the guys you're hanging around with, consent doesn't typically come into play. You're kind of, that's not part of the typical conversation. So we need to find ways to kind of educate men through, the channels are changing, and figuring out ways in which to kind of work with men to, or get information to men, that it's normal to say, oh yeah, my girlfriend and I talked about this and this is what we decided, or she really wanted to use this, so I'm going to support her in that way. So that changes the conversation from like suggesting that it's his decision to moving it toward that's kind of joint decision making or supportive decision making, where you understand that this is her decision and this is something that I'm going to support her because she's the person I want to be with. And when these interventions happen, a lot of times, they focus on boundaries. They focus on contraception and STI testing, sexual hygiene, and pregnancy prevention. But they're often couched in, how do you have that conversation? And that's really central to this.
Let's take a break. And when we return, we will continue my conversation with Dr. Shattuck about the different ways our culture is shifting how we view family planning and reproductive health. You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is The Metro. This is The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. Dr. Dominic Shattuck is a community psychologist, a men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and a faculty member in the OB/GYN department of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. We are exploring how men can take a larger role in reproductive health. So, Dr. Shattuck, as we re-enter this conversation, a demand for vasectomies increased after the Dobbs decision was overturned. And at the same time, we are seeing young people under the age of 30 or more or less interested in having kids. You find this particularly fascinating. Why?
I do. I think it's fascinating for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that vasectomy is typically counseled, and it should be counseled as a permanent contraceptive method, right? And so it's not, you can have them reversed sometimes. It's typically not covered by insurance, and it is often not 100% possible, right? So I think the reversal rate is somewhere around 50% effective, and it really depends on how that vasectomy was implemented on the front end, and who your specialist is to get it reversed. So going into a vasectomy thinking it's reversible is a big challenge. But I think it's fascinating because it tells us something about the culture too. You have this, and I don't think this is I'm not the first person to say this by any means, but childlessness is a dynamic in our culture that is happening more and more. And it's all about people making their own decisions and not having kids if they don't want to have kids. That's perfectly great. But I want to make sure that people are educated correctly. So are they going into this thinking that this is a reversible method? And if not, are those people potential, clients for a different contraceptive method that may be coming down the road? What's interesting about this too, sorry to interrupt, but what's interesting about this too is that it's not just men. It's more young women are getting tubal ligations as well.
Yes.
And choosing childlessness. So I ran a study recently that's about to be published in journal Contraception with some colleagues in Bolivia. And we're seeing it, this isn't just an American phenomenon, this is happening globally, where you see younger people choosing permanent contraception. And, the reality is that this says a lot about how people view their future and their future expectations around family, well-being, jobs. It tells us a lot about how people view the state of the world at the moment. And I think it's very telling that younger people are choosing this permanent contraceptive method and opting out of family life altogether, or those traditional family life, let's call it.
Yes, that you bringing up vasectomies. Of course, we're talking about vasectomies, but as well, I think about the young women that I know personally who've already had their tubes tied, the slang version of that. But I've
Yeah.
already known tons of women my age. I'm in my early 30s, mid 30s almost. But I've already had the procedure done, and I think about just the permanent action that is, and what it means, and how a person does have their own right to choose, but there is a myth for men that vasectomies may be reversible.
Yeah, yeah, and they got to watch out for that. I mean, it's like I said, it's a big expense. I think a lot of guys don't wind up going for a reversal because it's so expensive
Yeah.
and because it's not covered by insurance. But it's also like hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years we're going to have options for these guys, and I do think that it's you know uh, it kind of goes to kind of the point of you know when you're young you're making decisions and hopefully that's the right decision for the people who chose vasectomy. um, but life changes, right? So I never thought I'd be working in reproductive health. I used to be a school teacher,
Wow.
and you know,
Wow.
and played sports, and I was
Yeah.
not the guy you would have thought would have come into this space. So I mean,
Yeah.
life changes.
It certainly does. So a lot of people don't feel like they have the necessary support to raise children. Can reproductive health, the education, the work around it account for this?
I mean, it can help, right? So I, I'd love to see reproductive health education being kind of linked more with like community building activities,
Yeah.
situations where you're kind of I don't even know. I mean, like I feel like we hear so much about loneliness epidemics,
Yeah.
men and women, and I feel like growing up in a big family as a kid and somebody who had two children. My mom was one of eight, and so I had aunts and uncles and cousins all around, and it made kind of their time together. They could talk together while us kids did our own thing, right? So now you have these smaller families, and not that I'm promoting everybody has to have a huge family, but the idea that when you're in community, whether it's chosen family or it's neighborly dynamics, having people to kind of help in that situation really can help your mental health and your overall well-being of your family. And I'd like to see more of that in alignment with reproductive health knowledge and increasing, whether people have big families or not, just kind of being connected more in what they call third spaces and things like this would be great.
Yeah. Honestly, that was one of the themes or topics that came to mind for me when we were going over this conversation with the producer, Carrie Jr. II. And, the loneliness epidemic. And then I think about the loneliness epidemic, and then I think about vasectomies increasing and these things that are all correlated and happening at the same time. I find it really fascinating as well that we have this loneliness epidemic happening, but also seeing that folks are opting out of traditional family structures, or even just being in a relationship with someone that could possibly produce a child.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a combination of things, right? So as we're kind of driven to be, men and women are driven to kind of to careers and things like this,
Yeah.
and men are kind of driven to do things independently, be a little bit more stoic. But women are doing that too. I mean, successful women in professional settings and things like this are taking on some of these masculine traits as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's definitely thinking about loneliness and finding ways. I was on a panel not too long ago with a gentleman who he had produced a documentary that's actually also on Netflix. I guess I'm promoting Netflix today, but the thing is that it was called Join or Die, and it's about Robert Putnam's research and the work that he had done in the past. And
Yeah.
Robert Putnam is the Bowling Alone author you may have heard in the
Yes.
80s and 90s. Um, and so it's a pretty interesting documentary, and I was on this panel with the producer of that and the director of that documentary, and really interesting him talking about third spaces and how what used to be the Elks Lodge and the churches and the different community groups, how that has shifted quite a bit,
Yes.
and how some people are actually recreating those third spaces, not just virtually but also in real life, in the IRL space.
Sometimes you got
Yeah.
to remind folks IRL in real
Yeah.
life. Got to remind
Right.
folks.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Shattuck, personally for you, how does this interest in vasectomies impact the work you do in the reproductive health space?
I mean, you know, vasectomies is one element of reproductive health, right? I
Hmm.
mentioned before, testicular cancer. There's penile cancer. Some people may never have heard about that, but there's prostate cancer we hear about a lot.
Yes.
And these different reproductive health issues, we need to be educated about them. We need to also kind of encourage men. Most of my work is men's health generally, not just sexual reproductive health, but we need to encourage men to get preventative care visits, see their doctor for their annual checkups, and push their doctor to kind of like, I'm scheduled for this prostate exam, or I'm scheduled for this, this is a time when, I should probably be having this. What do you tell me what I need to know, doctor? And those types of things, so that they can walk out of there happier and healthier and more confident in their overall health, because it's gonna impact how they show up for their family, and it's going to show up, impact how they show up for their jobs and things like this as well. And you don't want to miss some of those exams, because oftentimes men have poorer health outcomes when it comes to cancer and different different health issues, because they present too late. They often present at a much later stage of the disease, where they're not able to have more effective treatments and things like this.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Tia Graham. My guest is Dr. Dominic Shattuck. He is a community psychologist, a men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and a faculty member in the OB/GYN department of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Now, as we've been discussing, more focus has been placed on contraceptive methods for men. Dr. Shattuck, you are on the board of Next Life Science, which manufactures a new male birth control. Can you briefly run through the kinds of male contraceptive methods in development right now?
Yeah, happily. Yeah, so this is a really interesting space, really cutting edge, interesting space. Not to make a joke about vasectomy and cutting edge, but the thing is that so there are these new methods, and men have always had very few options. Like if you look at different research around contraceptive methods, there are dozens of methods for women in terms of their various formulations, right? But really, there's vasectomy, there's withdrawal, and then there's condoms, right? So for men, and so people have been working on this for quite a while. I work closely with a group called the Male Contraceptive Institute. If you want to really geek out on this space, you should visit their pages and learn more about the programs and the studies they're supporting and the different variety of methods, the real details. But to kind of describe them briefly is to kind of say, like, these are all methods that are not available yet. They're all in different stages of clinical trials. Some of them are still in the laboratory. Others are, in human trials, and they're being tested with men. But they kind of, what's exciting about them is that they're like the early phases of women's contraceptive methods and that development, and they're designed to work in some different ways, right? Mm-hmm. So they fall into like three different categories. Some of them aim to pause sperm production, right? Mm-hmm. So using either hormones or non-hormonal pills that temporarily stops the body from making sperm in the first place, right? So there's that category. There are others that are blocking sperm from leaving the body, and that's like the Next Life Science group that I work with. One of their devices is a vasocclusion method, and they put a small gel or an implant that's placed in the vas deferens, and those are the same tubes that will be cut for and then cauterized for a vasectomy. And then, but it's designed to be reversible, right? So they're testing to see the reversibility of this and whether or not they're able to kind of reverse it, so that when you're ready to have a kid, you can go back into the doctors. They can give you the necessary injection, and then all your tubes will be cleared, and your sperm will flow through. And then there are other groups of these methods that they're disabling sperm function. So meaning the sperm is still there, but they just don't move as effectively as before, and they won't fertilize the egg inside of the woman. So that's kind of like, those three categories are really interesting, and it just kind of gives, if they do come to fruition and approval, it just gives more options to men, and it also will change the conversation around reproductive health, right? It'll change the way men and women actually speak with each other in terms of the options that they can choose between. It changes the dynamics around trust. Typically a man is trusting a woman and women are trusting themselves to use those methods, right? And how strong is your relationship? Would she trust him to take a pill or to use a gel or to go to the doctors to have this vasocclusion method? So those are things that as we think about these methods coming out and being potentially available to people in the next few years, they're not available now, but when they become available, how does that also change the conversation around fertility, communication, and relationships? And that's something I think about a lot. And I don't think I'm premature in that either, because I think it all relates to general reproductive health and making relationships stronger.
Once they do become available to market, male contraceptives, I'm very interested to see how it shifts the next generation of young men or men in general who will have access to it. But there are policies, that can help increase resources for men's reproductive health. We only have a few minutes left. So can you briefly highlight one or two that you feel moves us forward?
Yeah, I think right now something to pay attention to, if this is a topic of interest to you, or if men's health in general is of interest to you. There are several offices in the federal government around women's health. There are no men's health offices. And throughout the entire U.S. government. So I think, it's important to kind of bring this up in that there's a new HR 7602, a new proposed State of Men's Health Act. And so this is something that suggests that we open an Office of Men's Health to start thinking more about, what do we want men's health outcomes to look like? And it's not just sexual reproductive health. My interest is to have this as a key point in men's health. But it's a variety of topics, especially things like, drug addiction and, suicide, things that are really kind of deaths of despair that we talk about often at the American Institute for Boys and Men. Dynamics around like diabetes, like erectile dysfunction. People don't talk very often around the relationship between erectile dysfunction and cardiovascular disease, right? So like you have this major health issue that we do think about, we do see advertisements about, and then all the erectile dysfunction ads we see, they're all just about taking a pill so you can have a longer erection. I mean, the thing is that this all is related to a lot of it is related to your cardiovascular health. And so we need to have better education so that more people know about these things. And so that, men don't just, yes, we want them to be better partners. We want them also to be better parents. And quite honestly, we just want them to live longer. So yeah, there's a lot to this, and having a healthier constituency across all political parties. This isn't just a political thing either in my mind. I see this as just a health thing.
Dominic Shattuck is a community psychologist, a men's health fellow at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and a faculty member in the OB/GYN department of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Shattuck, thank you so much for joining us today and truly educating us more on male reproductive health.
Thank you.
Coming up, speaking of men's health, we're going to talk about the health of the Pistons heading into the playoffs. Are they going to be able to maintain momentum until Cade Cunningham's return? We'll get into it with Omari Sankofa II, Detroit Free Press Pistons beat writer. You all stay right there. This is The Metro.